Good afternoon and welcome to today's Alumni Book Talk. My name is Jennifer Hicks and I am the Director of Alumni and Stakeholder Programming at our university. We're really excited today to gather and hear more about this incredible book by one of our favorite alumni. But before we begin, I do want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the nature and the people who lived on this land before where our university is located before we did. At the university, we've made important commitments to reconciliation, and I do invite you and encourage you all to learn more about this work online and then in person the next time that we can get together on campus. A couple of quick reminders. This session is being recorded and we will share the link with you later on so that you can rewatch or share with your family and friends at another time. And if you do have questions for today's speaker during the next 30 minutes, you can type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom on Zoom, and we will feed them to the moderator to have some questions from the audience at the end of the session. Now, I'm delighted to introduce you to the author of today's book talk, My Best Mistake, Epic Fails and Silver Linings, Terry O'Reilly, and the moderator, Dr. Kathleen Peary-Adams. Long before he had a radio show, Terry was an award-winning writer at one of Canada's top advertising agencies, creating campaigns for brands such as Labatt, Bell, Nissan, and Pepsi. In 1990, Terry co-founded Pirate Radio and Television with 8 recording studios in Toronto and New York City. In 2005, he became the host of the CBC Radio 1, CBE's Chicago radio show Under the Influence, with over 1 million listeners a week, including many of us on this webinar, I'm sure. He's been given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Advertising and Design Club of Canada and an Alumni Achievement Award from his alma mater, Toronto Metropolitan University. He has a wonderful wife and 3 lovely daughters, at least one of whom I know is also a TMU alum. And I want to welcome Terry. I also want to welcome Dr. Kathleen Peary-Adams, who is the chair of the RTA School of Media at TMU. Kathleen's an experienced curator and media theorist who has developed exhibitions for TIFF Bell Lightbox, Toronto Photographers Workshop, Inside Out 2S LGBTQ+ Film Festival, and Images Festival. Welcome, Kathleen. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Terry and Kathleen, and I'll pop in later on.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, especially for that lovely land recognition. Hi, Terry. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having
me. Before we jump into the talk today, I just want to provide the audience a little bit of background about the book, My Biggest Mistake. Here and let you know that it has been shortlisted for a National Business Book Award this year. Congratulations, Terry, on that.
Thank you.
In Terry's fascinating and thoroughly researched book, he recounts how some of the biggest breakthroughs and product developments and some of our best loved products have originated with a mistake, and how some of these mistakes have led to dramatic life changes for the people who made them, including things like losing their job, their company, sometimes their credibility. But in the end, they have found ways to make these mistakes lead to new opportunities. So this book, for anyone who has the good sense to read it, is going to change the way you think about screwing up. It's going to encourage you to accept your mistakes and embrace the errors that you make and look for unexpected breakthroughs of your own and find your own silver linings. It's such an incredible compilation of mistakes. And it's such fun, so interesting to read about and very inspiring. So thank you, Terry, for having written this book.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed writing that book. It was a fascinating journey.
Okay, so to the audience, I just want to remind you that, as Jennifer said, we're going to put questions in the Zoom Q&A function, and then we're going to collect them at the end, and I'll read them out, and Terry will answer them. And before we get to that part of the program, I'm going to ask a series of questions to Terry, and we're going to have a conversation. We're going to leave a little bit of time at the end, so stay tuned, put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll bring you in towards the end of our conversation. All right, so there's a lot of fascinating mistakes in the book. Of all of these fascinating mistakes, I wonder which for you were the most revealing or inspiring that you discovered.
I think a number of the chapters, quite a few of them actually, had interesting little nuggets that were only revealed through the research. So I think one of my favorite stories, and I put it as the first chapter in the book, Kathleen, it's about the movie Jaws. And I know it's a well-told story, and everybody knows that it was this blockbuster movie and that the actual animatronic shark stopped functioning on Steven Spielberg, so he had to figure out a way to save his film. And it's interesting. So when he was shooting this film in Martha's Vineyard and he had 3 animatronic sharks built, he put them into the ocean and they sunk to the bottom immediately and then started to malfunction, and then they could not get the sharks to work. And imagine he was 28 years old on the set, has a full cast, full crew, his first big shot at a big movie, and his star of the movie, the shark, is not functioning. So he sat in his hotel room one night in the dark, panicking, and he asked himself a very interesting question. He said, what would Hitchcock do? And when he reframed the problem that way, he came to a solution, which was, what we can't see is the scariest thing of all. So he then rewrote this script to not show the shark, to just imply the shark. And it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to him, because that was the scariest part of the film, was that we didn't see the shark. We only see the shark for 4 minutes in that movie, by the way, the full shark for 4 minutes. But the thing that was revealed in research, which I found fascinating, was the reason it malfunctioned. And the reason it malfunctioned was Steven Spielberg had not tested it in salt water. He had only tested it in freshwater tanks in Hollywood. So that was his catastrophic mistake that he then had to scramble and try and figure out a solution for. And I love that story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it also says a lot about cinematic language too, right? Like how it evolves through mistakes. So yeah, very amazing.
Yeah.
So that's one of your favorite ones. I wonder more generally what the inspiration for the book was, and I wonder also if there was a notable mistake in your career or your life that acted as a kind of jumping off point for developing this project.
If you've ever listened to our radio show or podcast, you'll know that I'm endlessly curious about solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. So that's a real running theme in our show. And I wanted to explore further people who made catastrophic career mistakes, as you said in your intro, where they've lost not only their jobs, but their careers, their revenue, their credibility, but then it ends up being the best thing that ever happened to them. So that was really the heart of the book. When I was a young man, I got out of RTA, Ryerson, right into a recession trying to find a job. And I ended up eventually finding a job at a small advertising agency who hated my work. The creative director hated my work. Everything I presented to him, he would turn down. Then he would saw the corners off the ideas and then make it safe and then present it to the clients. And I struggled for 2 years at this job, getting, really, I just felt like I was maybe in the wrong industry because everything I presented was turned down. And I stayed there for 2 years in my 20s. When I got out of that job, I thought to myself, that's got to be the biggest mistake that I have made, is that I spent 2 years in an agency that really didn't want me and didn't like my thinking. But when I started my own company many years later, I realized that what that 2-year period that I thought was my biggest mistake was actually the best learning, because I was able to create and nurture a creative company by doing the opposite of everything they did at that agency. And I knew what it felt like to not be supported or not be, not have my curiosity encouraged. So everything I did at my shop was a direct result of that 2 years, which I thought was the biggest mistake of my career, but it ended up being the best learning experience. And I've dedicated the book. If you looked at the dedication on that book, I dedicated it to the worst boss I ever had, because he taught me the best lesson, which was how not to do it.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting that you were able to process that so quickly at such a young age, and that it happened so early. In a way, it's a little bit of stroke of good fortune that you were able to embrace that so quickly, and then, I guess, reverse engineer an environment that was really good for people's creativity and supportive of it.
That's exactly right. My next boss, just out of interest, was the exact opposite. He became my mentor. When I got my next job in the big leagues in Toronto, I had a creative director who loved my thinking, loved my writing, and really, really built me back up again and taught me so many things. So I went from the worst to the best. And then a few years later, that's when I started my company.
Mm-hmm. So there's a little something there about mentorship and context for making mistakes that's very valuable too. Okay. You were able to talk to all kinds of people, I'm assuming, in developing the research for this book. And I wonder if you had an opportunity to speak with anyone that you were very curious about and get a firsthand account of how they had made their mistake and then learned from that mistake.
I read a great book by Ken Dryden called Scotty, about Scotty Bowman, the famous NHL coach. And there was one sentence in that book that he says that Scotty Bowman made a huge mistake in Serge Savard's career, who was a great Montreal Canadiens player, that Serge Savard had been a young player in the junior A leagues. They didn't think he was good enough, so they cut him. They didn't invite him back the following training season, but Scotty forgot to tell him. So Serge Savard shows up for training camp in September from 300 miles away where he lives with his parents. He said, "Hey, I'm back for the next season." And Scotty thinks to himself, "Oh no, I forgot to tell him he was cut from the team." And anyway, so there was a little line in Ken Dryden's book, but that's all it was. So I contacted Ken and I said, "This sounds like it might be a great story for a book I'm writing. Can you tell me anything more about Scotty's mistake?" And he said, "No, but I'll put you in touch with Scotty." So I got to have a long conversation with Scotty Bowman, who told me all about that wonderful mistake he made with Serge Savard. And then Scotty put me in touch with Serge Savard. So then I got the other perspective from Serge Savard's point of view. And just very quickly, the whole point of that mistake was Serge Savard should have been cut from the team, but they forgot to tell him. So they kept him on. And Serge Savard ended up being a major superstar with the Canadiens. He ended up being the captain of the Canadiens, then the general manager of the Canadiens. Then he was in the Hockey Hall of Fame, and then his jersey was retired. Like, he had such a huge impact on the Montreal Canadiens, which should never have happened because, and the only reason it did happen was because Scotty made the mistake and forgot to tell him he wasn't cut from the team. So all of that came from a conversation. There was no research on that anywhere.
Right. Okay. Except the direct contact with the people involved.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. I'm curious. I want to ask you a couple of things about your process as a writer. So, and with this book, how long did it take for you to compile all the material? And what's your process? What was your process for gathering the research and the information? And also, what was the most challenging chapter to write in this book?
It took about a year to write and research the book. I have a great researcher who is a researcher on Under the Influence named Allison Pinches, and she's terrific. I'm a scrupulous note taker. So every book I read, you can tell behind me, I'm a big book reader. I make notes. So a lot of these stories I'd already made notes on. I just didn't have a book in mind at the time. So I went back through my notes, figured out which stories I wanted to chase. And then we started just researching mistakes out in the wild to see what we could find. And that became the backbone of the book. Is between me and Allison, my researcher, we researched all these stories and talked to people when we had to talk to people. The toughest chapter, I would say, would either be the one I just described, because there was no research out on it, the Serge Savard, Scotty Bowman story. And the other one was Brian Williams, the famous news anchor from NBC, who started telling a story and then about him being reporting from a war zone. And then he started to change that story over time. And eventually he changed it so much that it started to be a fib. And then he lost his job because of it. That whole story was really poorly reported, which is so ironic because it was about an anchorman in reporting, that it took a long time to find the beats of that story. It took a lot of research to find the real, genuine beats of that story. But it's a fascinating story about how he lost his job. And then it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to him.
Wow, fascinating, that one. The stories cover so many diverse fields, involve so many different kinds of people from all kinds of areas. And I wonder if you thought about what the connection between the kinds of mistakes, or the particular character of the people and how they dealt with mistakes was while you were writing it or after you'd finished completed the project?
It was when I had completed the book that I then looked back on it to see if there was some connective tissue, because as you said, the stories are varied because I talk about writers, athletes, doctors, singers, like from all different walks of life. But the connective tissue to me was this. I think there's two kinds of people in life who, when they're come up against a catastrophic mistake, there's the people who run away, abandon their dreams, just feel humiliated, they feel the shame of it, and then they just disappear. And then there's the other type of person who muscles their way through the mistake, where they own the mistake, that the only way out is through, and they muscle their way through. And then this amazing thing happens when you do that, that there is a hidden gift in the huge mistake. And if you peel, I say in the book, if you peel that mistake like a banana, you'll discover this hidden gift sitting patiently at the heart of the problem. And Steven Spielberg being a great example of that at the heart of that catastrophic mistake he made was the solution, which was don't show the shark. And he says not showing the shark added I think he said $175 million to the box office.
Real lesson in resilience there.
Yes.
The book, which maybe wasn't your original intention, but nevertheless is part of the power of the book, I think.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a more kind of general question. That your work in general, makes strong points about how friction is central to human desire and to our learning. And I just wanted to ask you to expand a little bit, and this is an invitation maybe to be a little philosophical about this. I wonder if you've noticed anything or have thoughts about how this works at the collective level. The stories that you're telling in this book are mostly about individuals and their psychological responses and their coping with mistakes. But I'm wondering if you see something about collective behavior that maybe builds off your last answer. And then also, and this might be a little COVID influence question, do you see something that's significant about common like thresholds for productive friction as opposed to things that are too much friction? So those are my two kind of open-ended questions for you.
Those are big questions. When I look back on my career, I have to say, and I'm sure other people feel this way, that I learned more from my mistakes than from the victories. That the victories are all for all different reasons, but the mistakes were real learning moments. And I think that is a very important aspect of someone's career, that you will make mistakes, but you'll learn. And if you're a quick learner, you won't make that mistake again. And, what is success but just a nugget pulled out of a pile of mistakes? That has been my learning. We have a podcast company called the Apostrophe Podcast Company, of which Under the Influence is one of our podcasts. But one of our other podcasts is called We Regret to Inform You. And we call that the Rejection Podcast. And I think your students would really enjoy this because it's a podcast about, we look at people, really successful people, from the point when they have their goal or their idea to the moment when they actually achieve success. But in that little center between coming up with the idea and achieving success is a ton of rejection, just a ton of speed bumps in their life. So we tell their stories and then we analyze how they got through the speed bumps, how they got through all the rejections. And everybody's story is different, which is interesting. But our takeaway, which is maybe the collective response you're referring to, Kathleen, is we say the true thing is never, ever give up. That's really at the end of every story, that's what we say, that we prove that all these successful people, there were so many times when they wanted to quit or they wanted to give up, or they thought this is never going to happen for me, but they didn't throw the chips in. They didn't abandon their dreams. They stuck with it. And I think when you're trying to get your first job out of college, out of university, it's really tough. I mean, I walked right into a recession in 1981. It was almost impossible to find a job. And COVID has turned everything sideways. it's going to be real tough for students to find a job, which it always is, but not to give up, that know that it's going to happen. You will find that job. And then if you're an entrepreneur like me, recessions have been the signposts of my career, Kathleen. I got out of Ryerson in 1981 into a recession. I co-founded Pirate Radio and Television in 1990 recession. And then we opened up 4 recording studios in New York in the Great Recession. So recessions have been the key landmarks of my career, which have made it very difficult. It wasn't planned to start all these companies and careers in recessions, but we never gave up. There was a silver lining to starting in a recession because you start very lean and very smart. So you know how to survive lean times. Then when times get good, you're in great shape. And then when times get lean again, you've been there already. You know how to get through that. So it's really, I think, resilience, perseverance, and just never giving up, even when it feels its bleakest time, is to stick with it.
Yeah. Some of what you're saying about your trajectory leads to my next question, which was about how your path evolved, and I love that it's moved from recession to recession. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how your time as a student at what was then Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University, how that impacted your career path.
It's interesting. I knew I wanted to be in broadcast. That was always my dream. So that's why I went, I chose Ryerson and was lucky enough to get into the RTA program. I didn't know where in the business I would end up, but I knew it was somewhere in the broadcast business. Every Wednesday, and I don't know if this still happens in RTA, but every Wednesday we had a lecture class where somebody would come in from the industry and talk to us about what they did for a living. So documentary filmmakers came in. I remember Lloyd Robertson came in to talk about, anchoring the news. Bob Hummy, the Friendly Giant, it's an old reference point, came in to talk about how to create a show for children. So we always had these really wonderful speakers. But one day, some advertising people came in and they talked about the advertising business, about working with products and brands and creative ideas and working with actors and being on location shoots. And I sat in the back of that room, Kathleen, and I saw my future. It was that talk. And I suddenly realized that's what I want to do. I want to be an ad copywriter. I just think I always loved commercials as a kid. So that sent me on my way. So when I got, left Ryerson, it was time to find a job. And I said, okay, I'm knocking on doors to be a copywriter. So it's the serendipity of moments like that. And which is why I give talks to colleges and universities when I can, is because I know that it changed the direction of my life. So I went just very quickly from there to a couple of small advertising agencies. Then I got back into the big leagues at a big advertising agency, met with the creative director who was my mentor, and then started my own company in 1990 and then opened up in New York. So we had 8 recording studios by the mid 2000s. And so it's been a wonderful career. I've loved every minute of it.
Well, it's great to have you here as an accomplished and esteemed alumni, especially as the chair of RTA. I'm particularly proud. I wonder if you want to share a few words of advice to our current students or recent grads, and maybe reflect a bit on something that you wish that you had known when you were a student before you went out into the world. Sage words for people starting in their careers, maybe.
I remember, and I don't know if this is true for everybody. I'm a classic introvert. I'm a situationally specific extrovert, which means I can become an extrovert when I need to be, but inherently I'm an introvert, which is probably ironic for somebody who has a national radio show. But I was hard to call up creative directors, big, important creative directors, and try and get an interview. It took everything I had to do that. But I'm so glad I did. So I would say to students, don't be afraid to pick up the phone or whatever you're going to do to try and get that interview, because you have to be brave for 3 minutes. And you can do that. Just be brave for 3 minutes on that call. That's what I really had to do. I had to work up every ounce of courage I had to make those phone calls, but I did it. I could muster the courage for 3 minutes. Then when I got into the advertising agency world, you have to present your ideas to clients in a boardroom. And being the introvert I am, I just, I was terrified of that moment. But I realized that if you don't sell your ideas, if you leave it in someone else's hands, they rarely get sold because they don't have that umbilical cord connection to the idea. So again, I had to figure out how to be brave enough to give presentations in a boardroom. And my mentor taught me how to do that. And then I actually stopped being afraid of presentations and started loving them. So I guess my big piece of advice to students is that you can overcome fears that hold you back in your career, because I'm the living example of it, that you can be brave for 3 minutes when you want to call someone up for an interview, or you can learn to overcome fear of talking in public or fear of presenting in a boardroom, whatever that your fear is. You can overcome that if you really want to, that it is possible. And like I say, now I do keynote talks across the country. I'll stand in front of, audiences of 3 or 4 or 500 people when I couldn't even present in a boardroom in my early days.
Right. So now you've worked up to being brave for an hour at a time, for sure.
Brave for an hour at a time. Yeah.
I love that. I'm definitely going to use that. Be brave for 3 minutes, because that's the kernel that you need to grow something that flourishes.
Because on the other side of that 3 minutes can be an entire job, a career direction, or selling a big idea that changes your life. Like that 3 minutes can be so valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. So though I'm not a current student or a recent grad, thank you for that advice. That's really a great one. We're going to turn to the questions in a few minutes, but I just want to end by asking what's on the horizon for you next. You've written a lot of books. Do you have another one that you're cultivating and researching?
I'm kicking around a couple of ideas for a book. I haven't landed on which one I'm going to do yet. I would say, though, in the immediate future, it's our podcast company, because we've got some great shows. We have a couple that we're going to launch. We have some big news that's going to be revealed in January, which I can't say anything about yet, but we've got another big show happening. So it's a wonderful thing. I mean, it's funny that audio has really become my life. And just very quickly, when I went to RTA, the first year was mostly radio back then. Second year was mostly television. Third year was mostly film back in the 70s. And I was so upset I had to spend a whole year studying radio. I thought, I have no interest in radio. I want to get into television and film. And how ironic that is, that I fell in love with audio and it ended up becoming my life, another serendipity moment. But there you are.
That kind of begins to answer some of the questions here. I'm going to merge a couple if our audience doesn't mind too much. There was a question here about having such a massive listener base for your podcasts, and why do you think those stories that you tell resonate so deeply with people? So
that's an interesting question. Our podcast, by the way, gets downloaded 7 million times a year. And that's a lot of downloads for a show about advertising, because it's a topic that most people don't like. They find, because my show is aimed at the average Canadian, it's not aimed at marketers. And it's, advertising is a topic most people don't like ads. They try and avoid them. They try and skip them. And here's a show about advertising that has all these millions of downloads. And I think the reason that we have so many listeners, I think it's storytelling. I think it's just the very act of storytelling that they're attracted to the stories. Not so much like, I'll get lots of funny emails, Kathleen, like, love your show, still hate advertising, love your show, which is we laugh at that. We get that all the time. But I think there's a compliment in there somewhere that they're attracted to the storytelling. We get emails, Kathleen, from people who say, and I'm stunned at how often we get this email, that my 9-year-old son loves your show. And I thought, oh, wow, I don't think you could have convinced me to listen to the CBC when I was 9. And a show about advertising and marketing is a favorite show of kids that are 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Like it's astounding to me.
Yeah.
But I think they too are responding to the power of storytelling, of a story that has a great structure and has a surprise in it somewhere, and you don't see exactly where it's going, and then there's a little epiphany moment. Just the basic tenets of great storytelling.
Yeah.
Not that I'm a great storyteller. I'm just saying that storytelling as a concept is a powerful thing.
Oh, I think that that your contribution indicates the opposite, Terry. I think you probably are, and from what I've read and listened to, you are quite a great storyteller. And finding the right stories, I think, is the other part of that, and you do a great job of doing that as well. Here we have some more questions about advertising. Was there a specific way that you got interested in advertising? You sort of touched on that, but what's one of the biggest mistakes you've seen in the world of advertising?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good question. I think the more general answer to that is that clients play it too safe. That the biggest tension in an advertising agency is between the agency and their clients. They're trying to convince their clients to do something, creative and interesting and surprising, and the clients wanting to put on the brakes. That's why most advertising is so bad. It's because everybody plays it too safe, and it gets boring and it gets terrible, and the whole industry suffers. So I would say the biggest mistake is not taking calculated risks.
Right. I see Jennifer has joined us, so I think that's the hook. And
I'm sorry that I have to join you. I think this conversation, people would have been happy to listen to this all afternoon. It's been so wonderful. But I do want to be respectful of not only your time, Terry and Kathleen, but also our audiences. So we will wrap it up and encourage everyone to go and get the book if they haven't read it yet for some more wonderful stories. Thank you so much, Terry and Kathleen. That was a really, really interesting conversation and a great way to spend my lunch hour. Thanks also to our audience for being here today. I want to leave you with a thought. I walk my dog daily, and I walk by the local middle school. It has a little sign outside, that is supposed to change every month with new information. But for the last two and a half months, it has said, forget the mistake, remember the lesson. And I walk by that every day and think that's a very good thing to be telling middle school students. I think that's really great. But I really want to go and put an asterisk now to it and say, remember the mistake, because maybe the best story is there in the mistake. Remember the lesson too, but remember the mistake. I think that that's really resonated, and I really appreciate you sharing these stories with us today, Terry. So until next time, to the rest of the audience, we will have another alumni book talk coming up for you in the new year, and you can watch your email for details about that, and also watch your email for a recording of this book talk so that you can watch it again or share it, as I say, with your friends. But thank you both so much for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Sure.
It's an honor, Terry. Thank you.
Yeah.